Despite the mountains of scientific evidence demonstrating that the Shroud of Turin is in fact the burial cloth of Jesus, many people reject it. But why? Based solely on one radiocarbon date test that was done in the 1980s, 40 years ago, claiming that the cloth dates to the 1300s. It's generally advised in good science to do several carbon date tests when attempting to get a date using the carbon dating tools to ensure accuracy. Yet in the case of the Shroud of Turin, only one single test was done. And this test is the sole reason that they claim the Shroud of Turin is inauthentic. When secular science gets a date from these methods that turn out to be false based on scientific discoveries, rather than questioning the method itself, they simply cry out, "Corruption!" This appears to be a constant creed that they incite in an attempt to maintain the integrity of their faith-based dating tools. And consistently, their only evidence to suggest that any given sample was corrupted is that it didn't give the date that they required or desired. This, by definition, is not practicing unbiased science. The Shroud of Turin showed these clear signs of supposed corruptions prior to attempting to carbon date it. Yet, it was not only acceptable to use these carbon dating tools to get a date for the Shroud of Turin, but to publish it as a medieval forgery. Purposeful lying can be the only conclusion from a rational skeptic's evaluation of the method they use when carbon dating for everything else versus the way they dated the Shroud of Turin. Measuring ratios of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the sample is how they conclude these dates when utilizing carbon dating tools. Their beloved corruption comes in many forms. If samples were exposed to fire, water, among many other factors, the sample is rendered unsuitable as a candidate for these supposed dating methods, because certain environmental exposures can alter ratios that are present in any given sample, thus giving an untrue ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 when utilizing these tools in accordance with their own standards. The Shroud of Turin displays severe burn marks throughout it and water damage, as it was in a fire and exposed to water as a result of that fire. We don't know how many times or for what durations, among other factors that it may have been exposed to. Like almost every ancient sample that they carbon date, they always assume stability over time, unless they don't get the date that they require or desire to maintain the integrity of the supposed scientific dating tool. We don't know what environment the Shroud of Turin was kept in for its 13+ years of existence. As well, we can see patchwork repairs on the cloth. And what we do know about its past through our observations of the damage throughout the Shroud of Turin renders it unsuitable for dating accurately in accordance with their own carbon dating standards. So by radiometric dating's own criteria, the Shroud should be eliminated as a potential candidate for carbon dating, yet they still dated it, one single time 40 years ago. And due to that single date, it has been widely accepted as inauthentic, despite all the overwhelming evidence that's contrary to this claim. Science should be consistent and unbiased, so why do we see the contrary in regards to the Shroud of Turin? Simply because it is authentic, and secular science would rather lie than accept evidence that's pointing to the Bible. What other conclusions could there be for these clear double standards in regards to the carbon dating protocols and requirements that renders a sample suitable for dating in accordance with their own standards? In this video, we are going to do what the atheists dare not do. We're going to discuss the evidence. Atheists, you may want to move on to some cat videos. It's going to get uncomfortable as we're diving into what science actually says about the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is the most studied artifact in human history, simply put, because it's baffling to humanity given our understanding of history and modern technologies that is apparent in this artifact. We don't know how it was created without technology, as the burst of energy that would be required to replicate the Shroud of Turin would disintegrate the cloth. But more baffling, it's the image of a man with all the wounds of Jesus as described in the Gospels, and it's printed on a cloth with a phenomenon that can only be explained by an immense burst of controlled energy and light. The Shroud of Turin is not only the best evidence for the existence of the supernatural, but it proves the resurrection of Jesus. Many atheists will say, why would God come to earth when there was no cameras? Irony is not without a sense of satisfaction as they study the Shroud of Turin. The shroud is an image printed on a cloth. Scientists have eliminated any other possibilities through experimentation. Attempting to recreate this cloth always ends in unsuccessful results. To date, there's not even a reasonable theory as to how the Shroud of Turin could have been created. Though people have claimed to recreate it in their zealous aspirations to disprove the risen Christ, they were all deemed unsuccessful liars for the ones that claimed success. God left us a picture of himself rising from the dead, and it's called the Shroud of Turin. In 1998, the first photograph of the shroud revealed upon development that the shroud itself is in fact a picture. The positive image revealed the detailed image that we all see today. But the cloth that was carried through history was a negative image, much less detailed than the positive image that we have today, thanks to the 1998 picture that revealed this amazing supernatural, unexplained event that was printed on a burial cloth. The scientific experiments not only concluded that the shroud was created with a burst of light energy, with a similar method to our modern photograph, but to claim the negative, less detailed image on the shroud was a forgery is strange in itself, as it's not nearly as detailed as the positive image that we now have today, and it only became apparent when we had the technology to reveal God's photograph of the resurrection. The only one that would understand a photograph before humanity did is God, as the Shroud of Turin clearly demonstrates the biblical predictions of what we should expect to find printed on this cloth. Atheists are terrified of this artifact, so they scoff and claim the shroud was disproven as a medieval forgery. And sadly, many Christians have just accepted this claim. It's illogical and contrary to the mountains of evidence that display the Shroud of Turin as authentic. The Gospels record in John 20, the burial cloth and the head cloth were laid separately from each other as Peter entered the tomb. Why the Gospels mention the burial and head cloth never had much relevance until our modern era. It was an insignificant detail in the big picture that has become prophetic only in our era. The Shroud of Turin was first recorded in history in France in 1350. The headcloth, discovered separately, called the Sodarium of Oviedo, shares up to 150 points of coincidence of blood splatter and wound patterns when matched to the Shroud of Turin. As well, both contain AV blood, with the headcloth retrieved from Spain, which is more historically documented, giving the latest possible solid date of 700 AD in accordance with historical science. So how can two separate burial linens belong to one man's funeral, yet be dated 700 years apart? In forensic science, they call this a slam dunk. This type of evidence would convict someone for life without the possibility of parole in any murder investigation. Yet, when we use this forensic science on the Shroud of Turin that displays clear evidence that these two artifacts are associated, it is rejected by those that claim to be rational skeptics following the science. These two artifacts, discovered in separate parts of the world with separate supposed dates, clearly belong to one man in accordance with the scientific evidence. I guarantee that those who would deny the shroud as authentic would be happy to accept the forensic science if it brought them justice in life. The Shroud of Turin does not mix fabrics in accordance with the Mosaic law and Jewish custom. The weaving patterns observed in the Shroud of Turin are known as the herringbone twill. It's rare, yet it's observed in many first-century Middle Eastern fabrics as the technique was native to Israel. Holland's dirts and limestones found on the shroud place it in Jerusalem in accordance with the sciences. The image of Edessa appears throughout history as the face of Christ on the cloth, as the shroud and the headcloth depict. This is where the early church likely got the image of Christ with long hair and a beard that we still use to this day in depictions of Jesus Christ. This likely comes from the shroud and the headcloth. The Hungarian Prey manuscript, predating the shroud's medieval date, shows Christ being wrapped for burial in the same position as depicted on the Shroud of Turin. The most recent scientific test was based on fabric deterioration. Examining similar fabrics from this area and era, the scientific experiment concluded that the fabric deterioration rates of the shroud would place it in the 1st century Jerusalem, when matched to similar fabrics of that era and area. The Shroud of Turin is not only dated to the 1st century Jerusalem with science, but how the image of the man with all the wounds of Christ and the real AB blood was printed on the cloth is beyond what science can explain, almost as if Jesus Christ was made of light.
Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life.
In 1978, 33 scientists from the Shroud of Turin research project analyzed the cloth for 5 continuous days, 120 hours, working in shifts around the clock. After 3 years of studying the results, all scientists agreed upon the following statement: we can conclude for now that the Shroud of Turin is that of a real human form of scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin. We know that this is a man's burial cloth. We know that it belonged to a 1st century Jew in Jerusalem. We know all the wounds that are described in the Gospels during Jesus' crucifixion are present on this man in the cloth. And we can't currently explain how a burst of light energy printed a man onto this cloth as the first documented photograph in human history. Logic must lead a rational person to conclude this is evidence of the resurrected God, Jesus Christ.